February 1st, 1943, late morning over the Tunis docks. The air is thin, cold and hard, so cold it stings the inside of your nose when you breathe. Engines roar in a steady, brutal harmony, thousands of horsepower stitched together by discipline and formation. Below, the coastline is a sharp line where sea meets city, and the harbor glints like broken glass. Up here, the world is only aluminum, vibration, and fear you pretend not to feel. A B-17 flying fortress named All-American holds its position in a bomber stream pushing toward the target area. The aircraft belongs to the 97th Bomb Group, and at the controls sits Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg, young enough to still look like he should be anywhere else, old enough to know the sky can swallow you without warning. You can almost feel what the crew feels, the constant tremor through the airframe, the way the fuselage hums like a giant metal instrument. The smell inside is oil, heated wiring, sweat trapped under layers of wool and leather. No one speaks more than necessary. Even jokes cost oxygen. Then, the first flak bursts appear, black blossoms opening in the air ahead. Not fireballs, not movie explosions. These are tight, dirty eruptions that leave fragments you never see until they hit. The bursts are spaced like a net. Somewhere down there, a gun crew adjusts by instinct, trying to drop steel into the one invisible place you're about to be. The formation pushes on anyway, because turning back alone is worse. Somewhere off the left side, a German fighter cuts in, a single shape with purpose, fast and predatory. In a moment, the sky stops being a highway and becomes a hunting ground. The B-17 is big, steady, and stubborn, but it's also a target with wings. Gunners track the threat. You can imagine the movement, gloves on grips, cheeks pressed to sights, eyes narrowed against glare. The fighter dives in, not for a clean kill, but for the chaos that comes after. He's close enough now that you can sense it, an animal moving through your peripheral vision. And then, in one instant, the universe miscalculates. The German fighter, out of control, wounded, or simply too committed, slams into the rear of All-American. Not a glancing tap, a violent, grinding collision that shakes the fortress like it's been grabbed by a giant hand. Metal screams, the entire aircraft shudders. The crew doesn't hear impact, they hear tearing, the kind of sound that tells you something vital is being ripped away. The tail of a B-17 is not an accessory. It's stability, it's control, it's the difference between flight and a spinning fall. For a fraction of a second, everyone expects the same outcome. Break apart, drop out, disappear into the harbor and never be found. But the bomber doesn't disintegrate. It lurches. It staggers in the air like a boxer taking a hit it shouldn't survive. Inside, men grab at anything solid. Someone's headset snaps loose. Loose gear slams into bulkheads. And in the rear, where the collision happened, a gunner sees something that makes his blood go cold. The rear fuselage is nearly severed. The tail section, the entire back end hangs wrong. Not fully detached, but cut so deeply it looks as if the aircraft has been folded. The structure that should be rigid is now a wounded hinge, held together by the stubborn refusal of rivets to give up. This is the moment where disbelief sets in, because the bomber is still in the air, and because everyone on board understands what that means. The next vibration, the next gust, the next evasive movement could finish what the collision started. Up front, Bragg forces his attention forward. No heroic speeches, no time for that. Only the immediate, brutal calculation. Keep it level, keep it steady. Do not ask the aircraft to do anything dramatic. You can almost feel the way he grips the controls, careful,
measured, like he's holding something cracked in his hands. The fortress responds, but differently now. The tail wants to wag, the aircraft wants to drift. It's like the B-17 has lost its spine and is now flying on borrowed balance. The crew begins the silent inventory. Is the elevator still responding? Does the rudder feel alive? Are they leaking fuel? Is there fire? Every answer matters, but none of them matter as much as the one hanging behind them. Will the tail stay on long enough to get home? The formation is moving on. It can't stop. It can't slow down. In a bomber stream, a cripple becomes a liability, an anchor, a beacon. If you fall behind, you are alone with the sky and whatever is still hunting. Bragg makes the choice all pilots fear and respect. He eases All-American out of formation, slowly, gently, because a hard bank could shear the aircraft in two. The fortress drifts away from the protective geometry of the group. The other bombers become distant silhouettes, familiar shapes that suddenly feel like they belong to another world. Now there is only one damaged aircraft, one crew, and miles of enemy-held territory beneath them. And in the rear, men stare at torn metal and ask themselves a question they don't speak out loud. If the tail comes off, do we even have time to jump? Because bailing out isn't a clean solution when your airplane is braking. A parachute only works if you leave before the spin, before the corkscrew, before the airframe collapses into pieces that take you with it. In that moment, the world becomes very small. Not nations, not maps, only altitude, time, and the thin, trembling line of metal holding your life together. And as the fortress continues forward, still flying, impossibly, another thought begins to form in the crew's mind. If the German fighter could do this by accident, what happens when the next one hits on purpose?
The bomber doesn't fall apart. That's the first miracle. The second miracle is quieter, more terrifying, because it forces everyone to keep living inside the problem. All-American is still flying, but it's no longer a machine you command. It's a wounded animal you manage. Inside the fortress, the air is suddenly louder. The collision has opened seams and loosened panels. Wind sneaks through places it was never meant to enter. Every draft feels like a warning. Every vibration feels like the next rivet giving up. In the rear, men stare at the torn fuselage and realize the truth. The tail isn't damaged, it's hanging on. Not metaphorically, physically. You can almost see it in your mind. The skeletal ribs bent, aluminum skin peeled back, control surfaces still working only because some thin line of structure hasn't snapped yet. The tail gunner can feel it through his boots, a strange, uneven flex, a rhythm that doesn't belong in an airplane, a rhythm that says, "I'm braking, slowly." Someone crawls back there, carefully, moving like they're crossing ice over deep water. The B-17's interior is narrow and unforgiving even in perfect conditions. Now it's worse. Jagged edges, loose equipment, metal dust in the air, the smell of cordite and oil. And then the sight hits them. The fuselage is split so deeply that the tail section looks offset, as if the bomber has been bent at the waist. The rear is still connected, but only by torn structure and stubborn sheets of skin. The kind of connection you wouldn't trust to hold a door, let alone the tail of a 30-ton aircraft. A gunner reaches out and touches a bulkhead. It moves. Not much, but enough. The man pulls his hand back like he's touched something hot. He doesn't need to report it in technical terms. Everyone can see the same thing. Everyone understands the same outcome. If the rear section separates at altitude, the bomber won't simply go down. It will lose control. A B-17 without its tail doesn't glide, it doesn't limp, it tumbles. And the crew knows what tumbling means at 20,000 feet. Up front, Lieutenant Bragg doesn't turn around. He can't, not really. If he lets his mind travel too far back into that wound, he'll lose the only thing keeping them alive,
his discipline, his attention, his hands holding the aircraft steady. So he flies by feel. Not instinct, not luck. Feel. He keeps the fortress smooth, no abrupt corrections, no violent banks. He avoids turbulence like it's enemy fire. You can almost hear the warning in his own head. Don't ask it to do anything it can't do. The co-pilot watches the horizon with a kind of frozen focus. Not fear, not panic, something more controlled, like a man staring at a crack spreading through glass, knowing the next sound might be the last. The crew begins making decisions without ceremony. They can't stay with the formation. They can't press the mission. They can't fight their way to the target and then home. There is only one plan now. Get out, get home. Pray the tail stays attached long enough to land. But even that plan has a cruel math problem inside it. Turning around means changing heading, and changing heading means banking, and banking means stressing the one part of the bomber that can't take stress anymore. Bragg starts the turn the way you would steer a broken vehicle off the road, gently, slowly, as if any sudden movement will snap the frame. The B-17 responds with hesitation. The rear end lags in a way that shouldn't exist. The aircraft feels like it has a delayed heartbeat. The turn continues. Seconds feel longer than minutes. In the back, men watch the torn joint between fuselage and tail. They watch for widening gaps. They watch for a flutter in the structure that means separation is beginning. The fortress completes the turn. It holds. For a moment, no one breathes. Then someone exhales, loudly, accidentally, like the body is releasing pressure it couldn't hold anymore. But the danger isn't over, it's just changed. Now they must fly home through sky that still belongs to the enemy. Now they must do it alone. The bomber stream is already pulling away, swallowed by distance and cloud, because war doesn't stop for one crippled plane. The B-17 becomes a solitary dot over hostile territory, a thing fighters notice, a thing gunners remember. A lone bomber is a gift. A lone bomber that can't maneuver is a reward. The crew braces for the next sound, the whine of an approaching fighter, the popping burst of flak that finds them again. But sometimes survival comes in the shape of absence. Minutes pass. No fighters appear. Not because they're merciful, because the battlefield is vast and chaos has its own randomness. The Luftwaffe is busy elsewhere. The guns are focused on the main stream. The sky is full of targets, and sometimes the broken one slips through. Still, the crew doesn't relax. They can't. Every gust of wind makes the tail shudder. Every pocket of turbulence shakes the bomber like a warning shot. And then there's the other problem nobody wants to say out loud: landing. At altitude, you can keep a crippled aircraft steady by being gentle. But landing demands things from a bomber. It demands lowering the gear. It demands changing speed. It demands flaps. It demands a final descent that brings you into thicker air, air that bumps and pushes and throws little punches you can't see. Landing is the moment when a wounded aircraft often decides it's done fighting. The crew begins preparing anyway. There's no drama in it, no speeches, just hands checking harnesses, tightening straps, moving equipment, securing what can become a missile inside the fuselage if they slam down hard. The radio crackles with strained communication, broken phrases, clipped calls, trying to let someone, anyone know they're coming in damaged, that they're coming in with a bomber that might not be a bomber anymore by the time they reach the runway. And below them, Africa stretches out, desert tones beneath clouds, until the familiar outline of base area begins to appear. A strip of earth carved into something resembling safety. You can almost feel the strange hope rising in the crew's chest. Not joy, not celebration, just the idea that maybe they can put this monster down and walk away. But as they descend, the air thickens. The fortress starts to bump. Just a little at first, then more. The tail shivers again. The rear fuselage flexes in a way that makes the men in back grab the nearest support, not because they're being tossed around, but because the structure itself feels like it might peel. And as the bomber lines up for approach, the crew realizes a brutal truth. The most dangerous part of the flight isn't behind them. It's about to start. Because now Bragg has to do the thing he's been avoiding for the last hour. He has to slow down. And if that tail section is only hanging on by torn skin and stubborn rivets, what happens when the airflow changes? What happens when lift shifts? What happens when the fortress transitions from flying to landing? And the tail decides it doesn't want to come with them.
The runway looks peaceful from above. That's the trick. From 8,000 feet, a base is a neat rectangle in a world of dust and distance. It looks controlled. It looks safe. It looks like the war can't reach you there. But inside All-American, the crew doesn't see safety. They see the final test. The B-17 continues its descent in careful stages. Lieutenant Bragg keeps it smooth, avoiding sudden changes in pitch. You can almost feel the weight of his hands on the controls, steady, deliberate, like he's carrying a cracked glass full of water and refuses to spill a drop. In the rear compartment, the men are no longer watching the sky for fighters. They're watching the aircraft itself. The torn fuselage line where the German fighter struck has become the center of the universe. The break looks worse in thicker air, where the tail section catches more resistance. The tail flexes with every bump. A skin panel flutters like a loose bandage. Someone grips a support beam and feels the vibration through their bones. This isn't fear anymore. It's comprehension. They understand exactly how fragile their survival is, and it makes every second feel heavier. As the bomber nears pattern altitude, Bragg has to begin configuring the aircraft. This is where normal checklists become prayers. Landing gear, flaps, speed. Each one changes the balance of forces across the airframe. Each one can shift the airflow enough to rip the back end away. Bragg signals. The gear mechanism begins its slow, grinding cycle. A moment passes, then another. The crew listens for the wrong sound, the sound of metal tearing, the sound of the aircraft changing its mind and breaking apart. But the wheels drop. The locking clunks are muffled by engine noise, but they're there, solid enough to bring a wave of relief through the crew like warmth returning to numb hands. Except relief doesn't last, because now comes the harder part, slowing down. A B-17 on approach is heavy and stubborn. You don't simply reduce speed. You manage it with power and pitch, working with the air rather than fighting it. Normally, you can make small corrections. Normally, the airplane forgives you. This airplane is no longer normal. Bragg pulls the throttles back slightly, not much, just enough to start easing the fortress down. The aircraft responds, strangely. The damaged rear section shifts again, and the bomber yaws a fraction, an unplanned wobble that makes everyone's stomach tighten. The tail is no longer a clean stabilizer. It's a hanging weight that doesn't always move with the rest of the aircraft. The co-pilot watches the horizon and the runway alignment. In the rear, the gunner's throat is dry. He can't swallow easily. He keeps staring at the brake line, as if staring could hold it together. And then the turbulence hits. Not violent, just ordinary low-altitude air. Small, unpredictable bumps rising off heated ground. The kind of air you barely notice in an intact aircraft. But here, it feels like hands pushing at the tail. The rear section shudders. The flex increases. One crewman hears a metallic creak, like a door hinge that's been bent too far. He looks at the torn seam, and for the first time he sees daylight where daylight shouldn't be. The crack isn't widening fast, but it's widening, and you can almost feel the thought moving through the bomber like a silent alarm. We are running out of structure. Bragg is close now. The runway grows large in the windscreen. At this distance, you can see tiny details, vehicles on the perimeter, movement on the ground, the faint shimmer of heat. He has to commit. The bomber crosses the airfield boundary and sinks toward the runway threshold. Bragg holds it steady. He doesn't flare early. He doesn't float. He doesn't chase the runway. He aims to put it down clean, because a hard landing could tear the tail off instantly. The wheels are just feet above the surface when the Fortress hits a sudden gust, a small drop, a slight jolt. But inside All-American, it feels like being punched. The tail section snaps downward and back, just a fraction, but enough to make the whole aircraft tremble. For one terrifying moment, the bomber feels as if it's trying to fold in half. The crew braces, not like men preparing for discomfort, like men preparing for death. Then the wheels touch, a fast, hard thump. Not catastrophic, not gentle, just real. Rubber meets ground. The aircraft weight transfers. The B-17 begins to roll. And for a second, it seems like they've done it. But landing isn't a single moment. Landing is a sequence. Now Bragg has to keep the bomber straight. The tail, as damaged as it is, still has to guide the aircraft down the runway. The rudder still has to respond. The brakes still have to work without dragging the aircraft into a swerve. Bragg holds it. The Fortress stays mostly aligned. The engines roar at low power, keeping control authority. But as speed bleeds off, airflow over the tail decreases, and that's when the brake line becomes a decision point. With less airflow holding surfaces steady, the tail begins to wobble more freely. The rear section shudders again. A loud tear echoes to the fuselage. Not a minor sound, a ripping sound, like fabric being pulled apart. The crew's heads snap toward the rear. For a heartbeat, everyone expects to see open sky where the tail used to be. But it's still there, still attached, still hanging on. Bragg brings the bomber to a stop. The B-17 rests on the runway, engines idling like a wounded giant finally kneeling. Inside, there is a moment of silence that feels unreal. Then the crew starts to move, carefully, as if any sudden step could finish the job. They open hatches, climb out, drop onto the runway surface. For the first time, their boots are on ground again, and it feels like waking up. Men from the base approach, mechanics, officers, medics. They stare at the aircraft with disbelief because the damage is worse up close. It looks impossible. It looks like the B-17 should have broken apart miles back. And that's the moment the crew experiences a strange reversal. They're not celebrating, they're processing. They walk away from the aircraft and look back at it, and what they feel isn't pride, it's shock. Because the bomber isn't just damaged, it's a physical demonstration of how close life and death can be separated by rivets, luck, and the decision to keep flying. Later, someone will take photographs. Historians will write about it. The story will become a famous, impossible survival. But standing there on the runway, the men don't see a miracle. They see a question that will never leave them. If one accidental collision could almost tear the aircraft in half, how many other crews didn't get a second chance? And as they look at the torn rear fuselage, the bent structure, the tail still barely connected, they realize something deeper than survival. They realize the air war isn't won only by skill. It's won by endurance, by machines built to keep going when they should stop, by men who keep flying even when the aircraft tells them it's done. And in that realization, something changes. Not on the map, inside the crew. A quiet point where innocence ends, where the war stops being a mission schedule and becomes something more permanent, something you carry. And as the engines finally shut down, one by one, the silence returns. Not peaceful, final. Because for this crew, there truly was a moment in the sky when everything could have ended, and they now know exactly how thin the line was.
The engines wind down with a long, exhausted sigh. Propellers slow. The vibration fades. The bomber, this broken, stubborn thing, finally becomes quiet. And that's when the crew starts shaking. Not from cold, from delayed reality. On the runway, men gather in a loose circle around All-American, as if it might still do something unexpected. Ground crews approach carefully, eyes scanning the rear fuselage the way medics scan a wound. The damage looks worse from the ground.
Up close, the clean lines of the fortress are gone, replaced by torn aluminum, bent ribs, and a tail section that sits just slightly wrong, like it belongs to another aircraft entirely. One mechanic steps under the rear and freezes. He doesn't speak right away. He just stares, because he can see what held the tail on, and it's less than anyone wants to admit. The crew follows him, boots scraping the runway, drawn to the truth like a magnet. They crane their necks, some lean in, others keep their distance, as if standing too close might invite the aircraft to finish falling apart. You can almost feel their minds trying to make sense of what they're seeing. A B-17 is designed to take punishment. It's built around redundancy, multiple systems, multiple pathways, multiple chances. But this isn't redundancy. This is defiance. A senior crew chief walks around the brake line, tracing it with his eyes. The split is deep enough to reveal the internal skeleton. He points at a section of torn longeron, one of the structural members that gives the fuselage its backbone, and shakes his head like a man who just watched a bridge remain standing after its center span was cut. He mutters something to another mechanic. They exchange a look that says, "I don't even know how to write this up." Because when damage becomes this extreme, it stops being engineering. It becomes a story. The crew is separated for debriefing, not formally, no polished conference room, no calm lecture. It's more like triage. Questions come fast. A clipboard appears. Someone starts counting them like you count survivors after a fire. Any injuries? Any fire? Any hydraulic failure? Any loss of control? The answers come in fragments. No fire. Tail flexing. Control felt weird. Couldn't risk a hard turn. Gear came down. Felt like it was coming apart on final. The officer taking notes writes quickly, then stops, looks up, and asks the one question that never sounds professional. "Did you think you were going to die?" No one answers at first. Not because they're brave, because the honest answer is too simple to decorate. One of them finally nods. A small nod, like admitting the sky had already claimed them in their minds, and they were only walking around now because something unseen chose otherwise. Outside, the aircraft is still being inspected. Men climb onto the fuselage with cautious steps. Others shine flashlights into the torn seam. Someone tapes off a section like a crime scene, not for drama, because jagged metal can slice a hand to the bone with no warning. The tail gunner watches all of it from a few steps away. He's staring at the place where the fighter struck, remembering the sound, the impact, the instant the aircraft's rhythm changed. You can almost hear the thought in his head. That was the moment. Not when flak started, not when the mission began, when metal hit metal and the fortress became a question mark in the air. And now, in the quiet, he sees something he didn't fully see in the sky. The tail isn't just damaged, it's misaligned, as if the aircraft tried to twist itself in two directions at once. The idea makes his stomach tighten, because if the tail had separated fully, no skill would have mattered, no courage, no training, just gravity. One man takes a photograph, not for publicity, for record. Because this kind of survival becomes proof. Proof that the aircraft can endure. Proof that crews can endure. Proof that in this war, impossibility is not a guarantee. But the crew doesn't feel like proof of anything. They feel hollow. The adrenaline drain leaves behind strange sensations. Dry mouth, numb fingertips, a faint ringing in the ears. Some men sit on the edge of a truck bed and stare at their boots like they don't remember how they got there. Others light cigarettes with hands that tremble just enough to notice. One of them laughs once, a short, broken sound, then stops, because laughter feels wrong next to torn metal,
and the knowledge that another crew, somewhere else in the sky, is not landing today. A medic checks them anyway. Eyes, hands, cuts, shock. The medic's tone is casual, practiced, almost bored, the calm of someone who has seen too much. He asks them to drink water. He tells them to sit. He tells them they're safe now. Safe. The word floats there, unreal. Because safety in wartime airfields is always temporary, a pause between missions, a breath between storms. As night comes, the base lights soften, the air cools. The bomber sits on the tarmac under maintenance lamps, looking like a wounded animal surrounded by caretakers. The crew goes to the mess. Food is served. They eat because their bodies demand it, not because they feel hungry. The meal tastes like nothing, or everything. One man stares at his tray and realizes he's chewing without remembering when he started. Around them, other airmen talk about sorties, about targets, about weather, about engines, the normal language of war. But this crew sits differently, quieter, because they've crossed a line you don't uncross. You can almost feel it, the shift from believing you have control to knowing you don't. Later, in the barracks, someone finally says what they've all been holding in their throats. We should be dead. No one argues. Someone else replies after a pause. Yeah, that's it. Not a speech, just agreement. In the dark, the sounds of the base continue. The distant cough of trucks, the clink of tools, the occasional roar of a departing engine. The war doesn't care that you lived through today. It keeps moving. It keeps demanding. And then the knock comes. A runner at the door. A message. The crew looks up, tired eyes narrowing. You can almost feel the dread before the words are even spoken, because there are only a few reasons someone comes to your bunk after you've survived the impossible. The runner clears his throat and says it. Briefing in the morning. Another mission. Another time into that sky. For a second, no one reacts. The room feels very still. Then one man exhales slowly, like he's letting go of the last illusion he had left. Because surviving today didn't buy them peace. It only proved they can be asked again. And in that moment, each of them realizes something they didn't fully understand when the tail was hanging on over Tunis. The war doesn't end when you land. The war ends when it decides you're finished.
Morning arrives the way it always does on a wartime airfield. Too early, too bright, and indifferent. The crew of All American walks toward briefing with a strange stiffness, not in their legs, but in their minds. They move like men who have already been burned once and now feel heat everywhere. The sun is up. Engines cough into life in the distance. Someone laughs near a truck. A normal morning in abnormal circumstances. But for these men, normal has shifted. You can almost feel it in the smallest things, the way they glance up at the sky as if it's watching them back, the way they instinctively listen for the sound of metal stress when they hear a door slam, the way their hands tighten around coffee mugs as if holding something solid can hold the world together. Briefing is crowded. Maps on the wall, target lines drawn, weather charts pinned, officers speaking with the clipped tone of people who have learned to treat death like an administrative problem. The crew sits down. And then it happens. The subtle, sickening realization that turns survival into something heavier. They are being briefed like nothing happened. Like yesterday wasn't a miracle. Like the tail didn't nearly come off, like the aircraft didn't almost split in two. The war machine has no space for astonishment, because astonishment doesn't produce sorties. The operations officer points at the map, talks about flak concentration,
talks about expected fighter response, talks about routing, talks about acceptable loss without using those words. The crew hears it, but their minds drift to something else. The place where metal tore, the moment the aircraft shuddered, the feel of the bomber wobbling on approach, and a terrifying thought forms, sharper than anything they felt in the air. Yesterday wasn't exceptional. Yesterday was simply one version of what can happen to anyone, anytime. One crew gets a miracle, another crew gets a fireball. It isn't fairness, it isn't logic, it's probability. And that is the moment where the air war changes shape in their heads. Because as long as you believe skill guarantees survival, you can cope, you can train, you can become better. You can imagine the competence bends fate. But when you watch a bomber come home held together by torn metal, and you realize it only came home because the structure didn't fail at the wrong second, then you understand something that can't be unlearned. Survival is not a reward. It's a coin toss. And now you're being asked to flip the coin again. Outside, mechanics have been working on All-American through the night. At least, they've done what they can, reinforced where possible, assessed what can be repaired, and, most importantly, decided if the aircraft is flyable again. The crew walks past the line of B-17s and sees their bomber. It looks still, quiet, but not safe. In daylight, the damage is even more unsettling. The jagged brake line is visible. Patches of metal glint under temporary repairs. Rivet rows look disturbed, like the aircraft's skin has been peeled and reattached. A crew chief meets them near the rear fuselage and gives a short briefing of his own. He doesn't make it poetic. He simply says what men in war say when truth must be delivered without emotion. We did what we could. That's not reassurance. That's an admission. Bragg looks at the tail section and feels something he can't fully name. Not fear, not anger. A kind of sober awareness. Because the aircraft is not just a machine to him anymore. It's a reminder that it can betray you at any time. And yet, he climbs in. Because what else is there to do? You can almost feel the ritual of it. The harness straps, the headset, the familiar seat that now carries a different weight. The bomber smells of oil and dust, but underneath is something else, the faint metallic scent of torn structure. The crew takes their stations. They don't talk much, because talk doesn't help when you know too much. The engines start, one by one, shaking the airframe back to life. The fortress vibrates, as if the aircraft itself is testing its own joints, asking its own question. Will I hold this time? Taxiing feels wrong. The crew listens to every bump in the ground. Every vibration seems connected to that rear fracture. Every turn of the wheel feels like it might pull something loose. Then they take off. And for a moment, the aircraft becomes what it always becomes in the air, a heavy thing trying to pretend it's light. The runway falls away. The ground shrinks. The bomber climbs, engines roaring, the world returning to altitude. But the crew doesn't feel relieved. They feel exposed. Because now they understand that returning to the sky isn't returning to strength. It's returning to risk. And in the climb, one man looks through a side window and sees other bombers forming up, rows of them, aircraft after aircraft, mechanical certainty stretched across the sky. It's beautiful and horrifying, because it means the war is bigger than any one crew's survival. The formation moves toward enemy territory again. The coastline approaches. The sea becomes a black sheet below, reflecting the sun. The horizon looks clean and calm, like nothing in the world can reach them. But they know better now.
The first flak bursts appear on the distant edge of vision, tiny black puffs, so small they look harmless. But the crew of All American sees them the way men see fire after escaping a burning building. They don't see puffs. They see the point where everything can change. And now, something else happens. Something you don't read in reports. The crew's mental distance collapses. They are no longer imagining flak as something around them. They imagine it inside their aircraft, because they've already felt what it does. They've already heard metal tear like paper. And when you've heard that sound once, you never trust silence again. Then comes the deeper realization, one that is less about the enemy and more about the war itself. This war is not just a series of missions. It's a factory. It takes men in. It grinds them down. Sometimes it spits them out alive. Sometimes it doesn't. And the war keeps running either way. At altitude, Bragg sees the bomber stream ahead, the target direction, the line they must follow. He knows exactly what's required. Hold formation, hold course, deliver bombs, return if possible. But inside his mind, a simpler thought forms, one that will follow him long after the war ends. There is no back to normal. There is only forward. Forward into another mission. Forward into another sky of steel. Forward into another coin toss. That's what no return really means in the air war. Not that you can't physically turn around, but that you can't return to the person you were before you understood how thin the line is. The crew holds steady. The fortress flies on. And somewhere ahead, beyond the clouds and flak, another moment is waiting. Another moment that could end in fire or end in a miracle. But now they know the truth. They know the war doesn't care.
If this story stayed with you, take a moment to let us know. A simple like helps this history reach people who may never have heard it. It tells the algorithm that these moments still matter. Subscribe if you want to stay with us. Here, we uncover the moments in the Second World War when everything changed, when there was no return. These are not just battles. They are human realizations, sacrifices, and truths buried beneath decades of noise. If you feel comfortable, leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else entirely. Tell us if someone in your family lived through this war. You're not just watching a video, you're helping keep these memories alive. Because once the stories disappear, there really is no return. Thank you for watching.